Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Judy Willard. And if you're new to the Policy Circle, we are a grassroots organization working to educate and inspire women to get involved in civics so that they can take ownership of the solutions needed in their community and in their state. And we put on the leadership series as a thank you to the volunteers that are really the wind beneath our wings here at the Policy Circle. And we do it as a personal and professional development, a thank you personal and professional development for them. And today I'm very excited to introduce John Silva from the News Literacy Project. And he is the Senior Director of Education and Training. And so today, John is going to walk us through a workshop that's really going to help us understand the origins of misinformation and teach us about the channels that spread them and how we can correctly identify the misinformation and then help stop it. So I'm super excited to introduce you to John Silva right now. John, welcome. Thank you for joining us and putting this workshop on for us. How are you?
Thank you so much. I'm doing very well, thank you.
Great. Hey, I have a question for you. What got you into this field?
So the News Literacy Project's been around for over 13 years. I've been part of the organization for 4.5. I was actually teaching middle school here in Chicago about 9 or 10 years ago. And one of my colleagues in my department came up to me and said, "Hey, I just found this really cool program. What do you think?" And it was our old classroom program from the News Literacy Project. And we started doing it with our middle school students, and it was a huge hit. The kids really got a lot out of it. They learned a lot. They couldn't stop talking about it for days afterwards. And if you know anything about middle schoolers, that's quite something. And then I was just coming across, trying to figure out how to move out of the classroom. And I came across a job posting from NLP, and it just clicked that it was such a great thing, great reach, amazing opportunity, and I jumped right in.
That's awesome. So give us just a little bit of background about the News Literacy Project, because a lot of people wouldn't even know that you guys were in schools.
Okay, so yeah, we're a national, nonpartisan, nonprofit organization. Our primary focus is developing education resources to be used in the classroom. It was founded a little over 13 years ago by Alan Miller. He formerly of the LA Times, a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist. He had given a talk at his daughter's middle school and realized how little, not only the kids, but also how little the teachers really knew about journalism, how it happens, and saw a need to be able to increase news literacy and to provide quality resources. And we've been expanding ever since. We launched Checkology, our online learning platform, a little over 5 years ago. And we just continue to expand our reach. We're in every country, or in every state in the country. We're in a number of places around the world, and we continue to grow. So we've also been expanding our efforts to do things like this, to talk to the general public, because, as many of us are probably well aware, adults need news literacy as well.
Yeah, for sure. And you know what? You probably are inspiring quite a few young people to become really good journalists. So that's very important for the future as well, especially for democracy. So John, I'm super excited about you walking us through this workshop. So ladies, get ready. This is going to be interactive. You might be asked to do a few things, but definite learning. So let's dive right in. John, I'll let you take over.
Okay, thank you. So as Judy mentioned, I work for the News Literacy Project. I am part of the education team here. My primary role is professional learning. I do spend a lot of time working with educators, learning about news literacy and how to integrate it into the classroom. But I also do spend a great deal of time researching trends and practices and things that are happening in the fields of misinformation, and also spending a lot of time tracking conspiracy theories, and really understanding a lot of what's going on, because there are conspiracy theories are always changing. There's always new things popping up. And it's also really important to be able to teach some of this to young people as well as adults. And as I mentioned, I was a classroom teacher. I spent 13 years in Chicago public schools before joining the News Literacy Project. If you'd like to get in touch with me after today's session, my email address is there on the lower left of your screen. Also, I am fairly active on social media in a professional capacity, sharing a lot of tips and resources. And that's my Twitter handle. One other thing I want to mention about the News Literacy Project is that we really feel that news literacy is something that needs to be embedded in across the American education experience. And by that, I mean actually the broadest sense of the definition of education. It needs to be taught in classrooms at younger ages than a lot of us are aware of. But we also need to be talking about it with adults, because I'm sure all of us know at least one person who has been manipulated into believing things that are simply not true. And we also need to be able to make decisions and be engaged participants in the civic lives of our communities. And in order to do that, we have to know how to be reliably and credibly informed. So what is news literacy? When we talk about this, it's important for us to have a common frame of reference here. So at the News Literacy Project, we define it with a couple of key things. One of the first is that each of us independently needs to know when and how to determine if the information we are seeing is credible, as well as the credibility of the source of that information. One of the biggest challenges is how frequently people just accept things at face value without any real critical evaluation. And not only do they accept it, they tend to share it. And this is how misinformation can spread so easily. We also need to recognize the importance of being informed. And for us, being informed by and large means knowing about the things that are happening in our community, in our world, through journalism, by information that's being reported to us by news organizations and reporters who are following the standards of quality journalism. And then finally, recognizing that journalism, a free press, and our interacting with them and being part of the process is so critical to having an active and engaged community and people taking responsibility for civic decisions. One of the most important things I want to mention, just to load this conversation about misinformation, is that if we want to be less vulnerable to it, if we want to be less susceptible to that manipulation, we have to understand what misinformation is and how it works, and that's what we're going to really be talking about. So the first thing I'm just going to ask this question, and if you would please just briefly in the chat, in just like 1 to 3 words, how would you define or explain misinformation? What words would you use if you were going to define misinformation? Judy says untruth. Interesting. Be sure when you're typing in the chat box, you change it to all panelists and attendees if you like everyone to see it. Elizabeth says false evidence appearing real, not verifiable. I'll give it another second to see what pops up. Not credible, lies that seem true. Okay, these are all really, these are good. And this is the thing, is that we often have some very similar definitions. When you look up misinformation in the dictionary, one of the important realities is that misinformation is a very broad term, right? And these are some of the words that are most commonly associated with misinformation. And what you see on your screen is how we formally define misinformation in our resources and how we teach young people, right? Information is false or misleading. But more importantly, we try to recognize that intent is a separate part of the conversation about what misinformation is, right? So misinformation, most broadly, is anything that's false or misleading that is created or shared. And intent is really not, whether or not people intended to deceive is not part of this formal definition. Because that intent is what differentiates misinformation from disinformation. And the reality is many people use these terms interchangeably, but they're actually very, very different. Misinformation is very broad, and it's actually been around a really long time. According to Oxford English Dictionary, the first usage of misinformation comes from 1605. It was actually in a book of poetry written by a guy who was in debtor's prison in England, describing information that people were using to describe poor people. But disinformation has an intent behind it. And it was first used in the old Soviet Union in 1923 when the KGB created an Office of Disinformation, right? And it's things that are false or misleading, but there is an intent that people know that it's false, and it's being created to be false, and it's created and shared in order to deceive people. So disinformation has a very clear intent behind it. And what's interesting is that I'm a data geek sometimes, and so this is from Google Books. This is called an Ngram viewer. This is how often these terms have been used, and I added fake news into this because one of the things it's interesting is that fake news has become a very popular term, but it actually didn't come around until about 2009, and then usage of it exploded obviously with the 2016 election. Um, but these are very different terms. So one of the first things that we have to recognize is that vocabulary very much matters when we talk about misinformation. The term fake news has become a very weaponized and politicized term. We often use it dismissively, right? And it more often means I don't like that, or I don't agree with that. Or perhaps people will use it ironically, right? We're dismissing it, calling something fake news. But it's a very nuanced topic. And so we try to teach this, that there's a very nuanced vocabulary. But one of the things that's also important to recognize, and I want to mention this also as part of the opening, is that if you're starting to feel overwhelmed, like if you feel yourself edging towards being cynical about information because there's so much false information and I just don't know what to trust, that's what misinformation is designed to do. Misinformation is designed to bombard us emotionally and psychologically to make us feel like we can't trust anything. And it's what really creates a lot of these divisions. And what we're gonna do today, we're gonna get into some of this vocabulary, we're gonna break it down, and we're gonna talk about a few other things so that we can have a really deeper understanding of this. So one of the first things that I wanna mention is what misinformation most commonly looks like, right? Especially when we're talking about social media. At NLP, we've defined what we call the 5 types of misinformation. There are several other taxonomies out there. Other organizations have created these charts. First Draft News, for example, has 7 types of misinformation, but this is how we approach it because we've tried to remove intent from these identifiers as much as possible. So I'm gonna try to show you some examples here. One of the most common on social media is called manipulated content. So the image that you're looking at here has been photoshopped. And in particular, if you look at the dresses of 3 of the women on the screen, 3 of these representatives, someone has added a swastika made from the yellow star of the Chinese flag to their dresses. This was not part of it, it's been photoshopped. And so photo manipulation, changing one aspect of an original image, is what creates manipulated content and misinformation. Sorry, I'm having some difficulty with my cursor here. So this is how we define it, right? When you alter something from an original and you create something that's false, the most common is using photo editing tools. However, you may remember a while back, there were 2 videos that went viral of Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, claiming that she was giving a speech while she was drunk. The reality is she wasn't. Those recordings had actually simply been slowed down 75%. And that manipulation gave the appearance of her being drunk. Another very common type of misinformation is false context. So this example is from back in March. Somebody posted a video to social media claiming that former President Trump was arriving on the Marine One helicopter as an official state visit to Davos, Switzerland. And the interpretation it was being used as evidence to suggest that Trump was actually still president in March of this year, 2 months after the inauguration day. So what made this misinformation? It was an authentic video. It was a real video of President Trump arriving on the helicopter, being received in Davos, Switzerland. The problem was that the video itself was actually from 2020. So there was no editing. Nobody manipulated it. They just changed the date. They made it seem like it was going on now. And that's what false context misinformation is, right? Is you just change the context. You change the context. Maybe you just change the caption, change the date. You've changed its meaning, and you've created something that's false. What we used to call fake news, we call fabricated content, right? And what makes this distinct is these are falsehoods where the articles themselves and the sites that they are posted to are trying to look like legitimate news sources. And by doing so, they've created something that's entirely made up, but they're trying to use this look of a news organization to make us believe that it's real. And these are a couple of very common ones these 2 sites in particular are shared regularly on, especially in QAnon Telegram channels, right? A lot of these articles, none of them are true. but they're designed to make it look like they're real, right? And they often follow a lot of themes, and they churn out a lot of the same content, but none of it's actually real. The fourth is similar to fabricated content, but it has a very important difference, and that's imposter content. So what you're looking at here is a tweet which is showing a screenshot of what is allegedly a tweet from the official Twitter account of the Chicago Police Department, claiming they put out this tweet in support of the convicted Minneapolis police officer in the murder of George Floyd. This is not a real tweet. It's actually made up, and that's what imposter content is. It's fake, but it's trying to use a well-known name, maybe a corporation, maybe a logo. It's trying to use that to give it an air of authenticity. Fake social media accounts are very easy to make. This is just a simple screenshot from the Google Play Store. You can do the same thing in the iTunes Store. There's a lot of apps that will make fake tweets, fake book posts, Snapchats, text messages, Instagram posts, you name it. There's an app that will create this type of fake content. It looks like a screenshot of an authentic tweet, but post. It's very easy. But these aren't the only ways that we often see imposter content. Here's another one that's really interesting. When I was looking for examples from the Chicago Police Department, I came across this example. So this is a real tweet from a real account claiming to be the Portland Police Department, saying we are Derek Chauvin. So I saw the tweet on the left. I clicked on the profile and look at it. Right. And obviously I'm looking at this like that's not the real account of the Portland Police Department, but it's a real Twitter account. So I did some further digging and I can see these are two real Twitter accounts, right? Obviously one has the blue check mark of being a verified account. And you can see the one on the left, the follower accounts are very different. There's a lot of things, but what I want you to do, I want you to look at the handle. So under where it says Portland Police, you see at Portland Police, right? Look at both of them. These are real Twitter accounts, remember this. Look at both handles at Portland Police. Tell me how they're different. Can you see the difference between the two handles? And put it in the chat if you see it. I'm going to give you a second to see if people can notice it. Kate says it's the font. What about the font? Here's what the difference is. In the font that Twitter uses, a lowercase L and an uppercase I are indistinguishable from each other. So in that fake Portland Police account, the word police is actually spelled P-O-I-I-C-E, but one of the I's is capitalized. Now it's a very narrow thing, but it's actually something that does pop up every so often. For example, there is a fake account that looks nearly identical to the official account of Representative Rashida Tlaib. And people often fall for it thinking it's her official account. So imposter accounts are very common and they can appear in a lot of different ways. The last one that I want to mention is satire. Now here's where intent comes into this conversation about the 5 types. Satire is a type of misinformation broadly, right? But the intention behind it is very different, right? Satire, if I asked you to define satire, a lot of people would have there are a lot of different variations, right? But the idea is that something that's false, it's meant to be false, but it's meant to, often we'll use humor, hyperbole, exaggeration, usually for some sort of social commentary or political commentary, whatever, right? Most of us, it's, satire, it's like, you know it when you see it. What makes satire very challenging, first, is that a lot of times people will create misinformation and then try to use satire as an explanation or as a defense, right? It's something that's false, they put it out there, there's pushback, it was just satire, it's not my fault you fell for it. But more importantly though, and this is happening more and more commonly, a lot of satire, especially from a source like the Babylon Bee, a lot of what they put out is very political, it's hyper partisan, and it often will feed into misinformation beliefs. But more importantly, what happens is, in this case, so they created this piece of satire claiming that the CNN broadcast said the shooter was factually Arab but morally white. right? It's a fake chyron. They photoshopped it, but in the original context, it's satire. Someone, and actually a number of someone's, took just the CNN screenshot, posted it out of that context as if it was a real CNN screenshot, and then people believed it. So it went from being satire to false context misinformation. It's a very common thing that happens. A lot of people will share things out of that satirical context and spread it, and so satire very easily becomes false context misinformation, to the point that actually a number of fact-checking organizations have had to issue fact checks saying, "Hey, that was actually from a satire site. It wasn't real. Stop sharing it." So why do people do this? Let's talk about some motivations. Let's try to understand like why this is so much of a thing. Talking about intent is often very difficult, but it's something we need to at least try to determine. But doing it in an objective way is very difficult. We can't always know why somebody creates something, why somebody shared things. Did they know it was real? Did they? It's difficult, but sometimes we can tell, and it often is what's really important, distinguishing disinformation. But when we have these conversations about intent, and we have conversations about why people created, why people shared something, it helps us understand misinformation. So we categorize these motivations into these four basic categories. So on one hand, some people do it because they're trying to make money. There's a monetary incentive to creating and sharing false information. Sometimes it's a fabricated site and they're trying to generate ad revenue. Sometimes it's somebody, they're running a scam of some kind. Some people do it just because they can. They're trying to see what kind of reaction they get. There is this idea of creating mischief. But more problematically, and when we start to get into conversations about our civic life, our political life, our social causes, right? There are people who use misinformation as a weapon. Sometimes they're doing it just to gain an advantage. But as we've seen in several of our elections, misinformation and disinformation are being used to really undermine our trust and our faith in our democratic processes. We're still seeing the effects of the big lie and the conspiracies and the disinformation and misinformation relating to election integrity, where people are still demanding that we audit the election results. People are believing that the election was stolen. There's a lot of conspiracies, claiming that former President Trump is going to be reinstalled as president sometime next month. And because people don't trust that it was a legitimate election, even though all the actual evidence points out that it was actually one of the most secure we've ever had. But it's undermining our faith and our trust in a lot of key ways. And when we talk about the people that do this, we have these four types of propagators. There's self-interest, where people are doing it because there is some personal thing that they're trying to achieve. The group interest we see most commonly in politics and social causes. Sometimes, though, someone sees something that's not true, believes it is, and shares it because they genuinely believe that there is something they should share. There is sometimes a genuine sense of altruism behind it. And then you have sort of the extreme end of things with the malicious intent, the trolls, and people who are deep into conspiracy theories. So I'm going to try to show you some examples to illustrate these so you can see a little bit of what I'm talking about. So this is an Instagram account of a doctor who runs a holistic health practice. And he shares a great deal of false information, trying to get people to not believe in particular traditional medicine. He shared a lot of things like this, false information about the effectiveness of masks, the effectiveness of the vaccines, and things like this. And he is spreading a lot of this because he's actually trying to drive people to his practice to buy his snake oils, his potions, his things, right? And actually, this account, and I'll recommend that you take a look at this at a later date. He is one of a group that's called the Disinformation Dozen. So the Center for Countering Digital Hate has done a lot of research into this. And this guy, I'm not going to tell you who he is. You can look him up in the report. But these 12 people are responsible for as much as 65% of anti-vaccine content, particularly on Facebook and Twitter. And these 12 people are just churning out a lot of anti-vaccine content. It's actually a really interesting report, and you can see a lot of about how it happens and see some of their recommendations. I'd really encourage you to take a look at that. And thank you, Maddie, for dropping that link in the chat. Another type of this, and when we talk about group interest, this is from actually, thankfully, this account has actually been removed from Instagram, but they're active in a number of other places. This is an anti-vaccine moms group. It is actually have a very large following, and they share a lot of anti-vaccine content. This one in particular was about the COVID vaccine. They had this false claim that Ticketmaster was planning, Ticketmaster was going to mandate vaccine IDs. They're not. But they also spread the falsehood about healthy people not needing a vaccine. So they churn out it because their group is trying to prevent people from vaccinating their children in particular. This is a really great one that is from about a year ago. And this is a sense of altruism. So I want to explain a little bit about this one. So this is where people were this hoax went viral a little over a year ago, claiming that if you put your mask, if your fabric mask, you put it in a microwave, you microwave it, you can sanitize it. It might seem ridiculous now, but think back to March and April of last year, in the early weeks of the pandemic, the lockdowns, the stay-at-home orders, the mask mandates. We didn't have hooks by our front door with a bunch of masks hanging from them. We didn't have a bunch of masks in our cars or our backpacks, right? We were making masks out of whatever we could find, bandanas, socks, and whatnot. So we didn't have a lot of masks. And so this is something that in our need of getting masks, a lot of people believed this and shared it. And it went viral to the extent that fire departments around the country actually had to issue these warnings saying, hey, if you microwave your mask, you might A, set your kitchen on fire, your microwave on fire, or B, your kitchen on fire, or worse. But you can understand a little bit about why people might share something thinking that it's real. And then the last one, this is an extreme example of malicious intent, right? And the more you look at this image, the deeper you look at the details, the more disturbing it becomes, right? You have the government checkpoint, the police department, the young mother is being held down on the ground, the baby's crying, there's the shot. You see that these are vaccine enforcement officers. You see the patch on their uniform. It's the Star of David. It says Zion in the middle. So you've got anti-government, anti-Semitism, anti-vaccine. It's all rolled into one. And this is somebody who created something for like sort of maximum emotional emotional impact. Before I move on, I'm going to get so Darla in the chat. She says, doesn't satire play a similar role as edgy art in that it pushes the boundaries in order to arrive at a greater depth of understanding? Yes, it does. Satire, I think, has a very important role to play in our public discourse, right? We need satire in a lot of ways to call out ridiculousness. We need to call out the things that our elected officials are doing, government officials, whatever. Satire plays a really important part in public discourse. Where satire goes off the rails, besides when it's taken out of context, satire, good satire in general, needs to have irony, humor. There needs to be a little bit of that usually. And there also needs to be some element of truth in there. The problem with a lot of satire is that in pushing the boundaries, they've actually crossed some lines in the sense that their satire is not based off of things that are happening and about commentary. It's based off of misinformation. So there's satire out there that's amplifying anti-vaccine content. There's satire that's amplifying conspiracy theories about the origins of COVID-19. There's and also a lot of sort of very hyper partisan political claims. And so yeah, you can push the edge, but there is an edge. And sometimes there's an edge that gets crossed, and you no longer have a credible claim of being satire. Okay, so let's talk about our emotions. Let's talk about why this affects us and how our emotions are part of the problem. Because it is. Because the reality is, misinformation is using emotion to manipulate us. In particular, what's happening is that when we have a strong emotional reaction to something, the rational parts of our brains are kind of taking a break, and we're just reacting without thought. And especially on social media, that reaction is having that emotional reaction and then clicking on the like button, the comment, the retweet, whatever. Our emotions are helping to contribute to the spread and the virality of misinformation. When we in our work, it's important to recognize that teenagers and older adults are very vulnerable, but for different reasons. Teenagers are especially vulnerable because their brains are still developing. The parts of the brain that deal with executive functions, weighing long-term consequences, evaluating things, right? Those parts of the brains aren't fully developed until the early to mid 20s. But older adults, when we start talking about beliefs, we talk about the things that we care about, we have a more of an emotional connection to the things that we believe. And when we have that strong emotional connection to our beliefs, we are very susceptible to emotional manipulation. And any emotion can actually be used against us, right? In a lot of it, we see there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of fear. But here in Illinois, where I live in Chicago, um, the state has been issuing these warnings saying, hey, if you get a text message from the Secretary of State's office about your driver's license, it's not real. I've gotten probably 5 or 6 in the last week or two, these random text messages claiming that I have to be in touch with the Secretary of State about my driver's license, right? And if I click on the link, it's probably a phishing scam that's designed to get my personal information, right? But there can be a sense of curiosity, right? And humor. And I'm going to show you a couple of things that illustrate some of these a little bit more. Another aspect of this is about rumor theory. So when we talk about sharing information, humans are social creatures, right? We want to share the things that are going on in our lives. And when we connect with people, especially people we haven't seen in a long while, the way we connect is about sharing stories. It's a very important part of being human. It's something that we've always done. And it's part of this idea that we want the world to make sense. And when it doesn't make sense, we try to look for information and we share it with others and we try to put it together to make things make sense, right? And that's how in the past, that's how legends and myths came about, right? And it's an important emotional need for us, right? We want to feel more secure what's going on. In the modern context, though, social media has taken this and amplified it in 2 really important ways. First, social media gives us the ability to share with literally anyone in the world, right? We can share anything with pretty much anyone at any time. We have billions of people are connected through the internet in different ways, right? So that's one, is that we're not limited to the people that we can talk to in person or call on the phone. The other part of this, though, is that social media has, in a couple of important ways, conditioned us to share more about our lives than we used to, right? So if you think about the things that you shared with friends and family before social media, right? But also technology, connected to this, the technology that connects it, right? There was no social media. There was no real internet. I didn't have a phone or a video camera with me at all times when I was a young Marine in the late 80s and early 90s, right? So those things thankfully aren't documented, right? But social media also amplifies it in a way that sort of conditions us to overshare, and that all of this is tied together. We want to share, we want to connect, and in that is where misinformation can manipulate that, because it might elicit a response for us to share things that aren't true. Before I get into the next section on red flag phrases, I'm just going to pause to see if anybody has any questions or comments at this point. I got a couple of things to share with you still. We're trucking along. We're cramming a lot into this. Any questions or comments?
Yeah, John, this is Judy. One thing, I was so shocked by that picture that you showed of the police department, the Twitter handle, because I could not find the difference. I literally was like, I don't see any difference at all. So right. I'm hoping at some point you give us some tips on how we can kind of do that on our own. You said something about a check mark, a blue check mark next to the person's account or something, but those are things that I didn't even know. I would be duped by a fake account.
Yeah. So, I mean, the thing is, the difference is, like, do you see just the tweet in your feed, or do you click on the profile to look at the profile? And the unfortunate thing is most people don't take that step to actually look at the profile, right? We just respond to the content of the tweet itself. I'll share some tools about how to verify information, look up some things.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, so let's get into some common red flag phrases. Darla adds, the science is subtle, all experts agree. Yeah, I like those. Those aren't part of my red flag phrases, but those are good ones. So these are some of the more common ones. So you'll see this very common. They make this go viral, right? This is the false claim that the false claim that Vice President Harris is an anchor baby and somehow she's not eligible to be president. None of those things are true. But the idea of saying make this go viral is kind of a challenge, right? It's a jump on the bandwagon kind of emotional need. Here's this thing, a lot of people are sharing it. You don't want to miss out on it. Help us make this go viral, right? A lot of people have this, a lot of, especially young people, they want things to go viral. And as someone who has had something go viral before, it's not always fun. Another one is this idea there's a big secret, right? The media won't report this. Here's this thing that's out there. Nobody, media's not reporting it, so we're going to share it. Obviously one of my favorite questions to ask back is, well, if the media won't report it, how do you know about it? It's just a big red flag. The media won't report this, right? Chances are the reason the media isn't reporting it is because it's not true. It's false in one way, right? Yeah, and one of the things in the anti-vaccine, spike proteins is really popular in the anti-vaccine movement these days. It's completely false. Let that sink in. Here's this piece of information. I know it. I understand it. I'm sharing with you. You don't get it. So I'm just going to let it sink in. We don't like the discomfort that we may not understand something, or we might not know something, and we might just let it go and then just agree with it and move on. Let that sink in is a challenging phrase. It's this idea here. Take a look at this. One of my favorites is like somebody makes this like broad claim, right? So like the one on the left, the Tuskegee experiment was also conducted by the CDC and the Manhattan Project, right? So this idea that because the CDC, was involved in the horrifying the horrifying details of the Tuskegee experiments, right? Somehow that's evidence that the CDC is doing worse today, right? There's a false equivalence there. And so let that sink in. Very, very common. There are no coincidences. This is an unofficial motto of the QAnon movement in particular, right? So there are no coincidences, right? So this is a false claim. There's a fake tweet that was attributed to John McAfee claiming that he owned a condo unit in the building that collapsed in Florida, right? And there's a fake tweet in there, right? So there's no coincidences. So the idea is that somehow they're trying to claim that the destruction of that condo building was deliberately done to destroy John McAfee's evidence or something. I don't know, but that there are no coincidences. Of course there are. Coincidences exist. Another one that's also very, very popular is do your own research. This is very, very common among anti-vaxxers. This is the idea that, if you just do your own research, you'll find the truth, right? But really what you're doing is you're Googling something and you're probably engaged in motivated reasoning. And what they're expecting you to do is go down a path to like just have these false beliefs reinforced. Do your own research is very, very common. Because most of us can't do the legitimate scientific research to prove or disprove the efficacy of vaccines. So do your own research, big warning, big red flag. So let me show you some skills that you can practice. And then I'm gonna have you actually practice a couple of them. So these are some of the most common fact-checking skills that you're gonna use and you should start practicing. We're gonna talk about observation, reverse image search, and lateral reading. So critical observation is actually one of the first ones. The idea is that if you see something and you're having a emotional reaction, take a closer look at it, right? Just look at it closely, look at the details. What can you see? What can it tell you? And by doing this critical observation, you're doing two really important things. First, you're looking for some details that might help you prove it or disprove it. But the other thing is when you pause and you start to look at something closely, you're turning off that emotional response and you're activating the critical parts of your brain, and you're going to have a more rational response to what you're seeing. So I'm going to show you an image, and what I'm going to ask you to do is two things. One is comment on what your initial reaction to it is, right? So you're going to see it. What's your reaction to it? And then look at it and then tell us in the chat what evidence, what you might see that indicates that what you're looking at might not be real. Okay, are you ready? Heinz is making Maorio sauce. Here is an image taking of a picture of a person holding this bottle in a grocery store. So first off, what is your initial reaction to this image? Go ahead and drop that in the chat. Use just a word or two. What's your initial reaction? Ick, gross, fake. So a couple things to look at right here. This is a verified account. This is from Facebook. You can see when I took the screenshot, there have been 72,000 reactions to it, 23,000 comments, 55,000 shares, right? So people were sharing this, commenting on it, liking it, whatever. Some laughter reactions, some thumbs up, some shocked reactions. All right, so let's take a closer look. What do you see in this image? Let's take a close look. What do you see in this image that might indicate that either is or is not a real product from Heinz? Right. So if you look at the top of the label, it has in brackets Dr. Photograph, right? So that's a big red flag. But how many of you are really going to notice that unless you're really looking closely, right? Most of us are going to look at what's on the label, and then we're going to look probably look at the contents of the bottle, trying to figure out exactly what it is, right? You got to look closely and see that. So observation is one. Since a lot of misinformation is visual, a reverse image search is going to be really, really important here, right? So here we've got what we think is it's possible manipulated content, right? Right, or it's fabricated. I'm not sure, but let's take a look. So what reverse image search does, it's a specialized search tool. So you're going to try to match the pixel patterns of the original image to images in the search database. There are a number of them out there. Google has its own image search tool. TinEye, Bing has them. A number of them do. There's multiple ways to do it. I'm going to show you how to do it from your browser, which is one of the more common ones. But there are also some mobile apps, and we can provide some resources a bit later if you want to follow up on that. But so I'm going to go to the original post. In this case, it's a Facebook post. I'm going to put my cursor over the image, and I'm going to right click. And by doing that, it pops up a menu. In this case, I'm using Google Chrome with Google as my default search engine, but this works in all major browsers, right? And I'm going to click search Google for image, right? Now, here's the interesting thing. When this image first went viral and I did a reverse image search, nothing came up. The best guess from the search engine was shelf, right? And so the first things are about shelves from Amazon. The images were somewhat similar, right? I see other Heinz products, like I actually see legitimate Heinz products in here. Right? I see their mayo chip, which is probably a little equally gross, but there's nothing there. It's not there. And sort of in the first day or two after that image went viral, was nothing there. A week later, though, when I did a reverse image search, the first thing that pops up is Maorio Heinz. Because the thing is, when things are posted to the internet, it takes a couple of days for the search engines to index and update the search results. So this is where you have to be very careful, right? And so a week later, the first thing that pops up, one is a fact check from the USA Today. The other one is actually a link to Heinz. And then when I look at the similar images, I see several things that are linking to it, right? So you got to be very careful. So reverse image search, a lot of it will either be really effective right away, or it may take a while, which is where the third skill becomes really important, which is called lateral reading. So lateral reading is derived from research done by Sam Weinberg and Sarah McGrew at the Stanford Graduate School of Education. They've been studying for several years what they call online civic reasoning, focusing on young people and whether or not they can critically evaluate information they see. But the idea behind lateral reading is that it's about verifying what you're reading while you're reading it. And the basic way you do that is by opening up a browser window and you're searching for information to verify what you're seeing, verify credibility, verify the source, trying to get more background information, more context. And you're using a search to figure out what it is that you're looking at about whether or not you can trust it and act on it, right? There are some ways that you can do this. If you have a phrase, you can put something in quotation marks, search for an exact phrase, turn it into a question. Boolean searches, adding, requiring or excluding certain terms. But one of the most important things is what's called click restraint. Don't just click on the first link that pops up in the search results. You got to look very carefully. So I'm going to Google Maorio Hines and going to see what I can find. And so in a lot of cases, search engines are prioritizing fact checks if it thinks that you're trying to fact check something. And here are the first couple of things that pop up. One is an article from Snopes, and then I got another one called the Focus.news, right? And I can look at Snopes website. Snopes, has this fact check. Nope, it's not true. But another thing that's important, we saw that doctor photograph. When we see something that makes us suspicious, we can search for that detail as well. And the interesting thing is that by searching Maorio Hines, I found these fact checks. But by searching for Dr. Photograph, I found the Instagram account that actually posted it. And I can actually see by looking at their account that this is what this account does. It creates fake products that are designed to look like they're authentic, right? And this is actually a really important part of the conversation, because where we see it has a very big influence on how we perceive it, right? So the original source is from an Instagram account that posts images of fake products. If we saw it in that context, we would likely know that it was not true, and we would laugh at it and we would move on. The problem is that that's not the source that went viral. It's this verified Facebook account. This person has hundreds of thousands of followers, right? And he posted it out of context, right? And so maybe a number of the people didn't believe it, but a number of them likely did believe it, and they shared it out of that context. So where we see it, where we encounter it, does have a big influence on how we perceive it and what we do with it, right? If you saw it in the original context of the Dr. Photograph Instagram account, you're not going to fact check it, because you don't need to, because you know that that's what that account does. But if you see it in another feed, right, then that's when you need to be a little bit more on guard, and you have to be a little bit more aware of what you're doing. Last thing I'm going to mention, because I'm running low on time here, is about the fact checking organizations. I get asked a lot about whether or not there's one that I recommend over others. I'll share a couple with you in just a second, but the most important thing is when you're looking at a fact check organization, you need to evaluate them as well. The ones that are more reputable, more credible, are the ones that show their work. They don't just tell us whether or not something is true. They tell us what it is, how they know, they give us context, they give us background, they link to the evidence that they find, but also, and perhaps in some ways more importantly, when they give things a rating, they have information about how they do that. What's their methodology, right? Some people will say something is true or false, but other fact-checking organizations have kind of a scale. Like the Washington Post uses a number of Pinocchio's scale. There's one that will say something is like a pants on fire falsehood, and so there's some of them have a range. But as with a lot of other things, it's really important to go to more than one. And these are some of the ones that are more credible out there. I am going to pause here to see if we have any questions or comments that you would like me to address, because I seem to have underestimated how much time I have and how much time I need. I do have an example I can show you in a second to give you a chance to fact check it.
John, thank you. I'll let the ladies be thinking of questions to pop them in the chat. And we don't have to quit right at noon. If people have to jump off at noon, that's fine. But okay. We'd rather have you when we can, and we will have we're sure. Recording this, so we want it to be as thorough as possible. So anybody got a question? Pop it in the chat for John.
So I know this is a downer idea, but what are suggestions on how we guide students to balance what media outlets they value and look to for truth? These days, some are inclined to not even trust us about what is legitimate. So I think one of the most important things is that we have to teach what the standards of quality of journalism are, what makes a news organization and a reporter reputable when they're reporting straight news, excluding commentary, right? And knowing what those standards are and how news organizations and reporters follow them to report on the news is really important. The other is recognizing the difference between news and opinion. This is something that a lot of adults struggle with. There's so much opinion and commentary out there that we often conflate it, news and opinion, because it's all talking about the same topics, and we often don't recognize the important differences. So we need to teach young people what makes a news organization more credible, more reliable, how to recognize what straight news is, but also being open to the idea that I might be more informed about something from an organization that publishes commentary that kind of goes against my general beliefs. Right? If we exclude an entire source of information because of a perceived bias, right, we're doing ourselves a real disservice by just basically building an echo chamber. Right? If I say I'm not going to look at news from that source because they are too conservative or they are too liberal, right? I'm ignoring an entire source of information. And so it's really important to be willing to get news from a lot of different sources and have that varied diet. But the other thing to recognize is that young people aren't going to CNN's website, or they're not necessarily watching Fox News, right? They're seeing news that's coming across their social media feeds. And that the same is also increasingly true for a lot of adults. Um, so Darla asks, is the redundancy of regurgitated information, same pattern of facts, a sign of accuracy or inaccuracy? Or is it just a sign of information landscape that isn't quite fully developed? It kind of depends on what's being reported, right? In a breaking news event, for example, or a major breaking news event, there may not be a lot of details that have been verified, and a lot of news organizations are probably reporting some of the same things, right? So Jill mentions the Kobe Bryant crash, right? Yeah, so there's a lot of things that come out in a breaking news event. The things that have been verified, information often comes out slowly. But part of it also depends on how deep, news organizations are willing to go on some stories, right? A print story is going to go into a lot more context and background than um, a YouTube video or a television broadcast. But I think if you're seeing redundancy of information, you're seeing news organizations that are likely reporting the same information that's been verified from very similar or even the same sources. And I think that that's actually a sign that what you're seeing is probably fairly accurate, because that's the thing, is like information, once it's been verified, right, there's not going to be a lot of nuances about the who, what, where, or when. And if you start seeing people getting more into like why and how, that's where you're seeing probably deeper analysis, and then maybe even edging into commentary. So it's very conditional upon what it is that you're looking at. But yeah, you don't want to find yourself in a filter bubble. Okay, I'm going to have you do a reverse image search. So I'm going to drop a link to this tweet in the chat. So what you're going to do is you're going to go to this tweet, you're going to go to this image, you're going to right click on it, you're going to click on search for image, and you're going to come back and tell us whether or not this is a real image. And if you determine that it is not, what has been changed to make this misinformation? I'll give you a couple minutes to go take a look at that, and let's see what people come up with. Okay, so Kate found the article on Snopes called Photography, F-A-U-X. I love that category of photography. Right, so this is not an authentic image. So what's been changed? What does the original image look like? Is anyone finding it? He's pointed to David tomato sauce. Right. So so here's the original. I'll just walk you through it real quick. Right. So I right click on it. I search Google for image. It's going to upload. Right. And then I see a couple of things, right? I see a fact check, but I see a number of other websites. Some of them are fact checking. Some of them are just amplifying the original misinformation, right? And if I can go to this one, checkyourfact.com. Here's the original Photoshopped, and this is the original image. This is the real one. So this is what it looks like. And so this is the Mayorio and the Steve Rogers and Steve Irwin and Mr. Rogers image highlights a really important thing, that not all misinformation is political. A lot of times it is designed, is simply meant to be funny. It's meant to sort of create sometimes engagement bait. We're trying to get people to follow an account so they can monetize it, right? But you can imagine how sometimes we just might let things slide. Okay, so since I have a little bit of time, well, since you're giving me a little bit more time, I'm going to go into the last piece I'm going to mention, and this is another way that we can be manipulated, is talking about our cognitive biases. This is the ways that our thinking can get hijacked, and a lot of times it has to do with belief. And sometimes when we have things that we believe, we like the feeling when things agree with us. And the way we feel about things becomes more important than whether or not they're true, because we believe them. And if those beliefs are based off of falsehoods, then that's where things become very difficult, because it can be very easily to manipulate our biases to short circuit our critical thinking. And when we talk about how we verify information and fact checking and logic checking, understanding how our brains work and how this happens is really important part of recognizing how and why we can be manipulated. So I'm going to show you some of the very common ones here. The first one is one of the most common cognitive biases that we are all subject to. It's called confirmation bias. Simply put, if something agrees with something that we believe in, we like that. We like that feeling. It makes us feel good when something agrees with us. And so we are likely to just accept it passively without questioning it. But the reverse is also true. If something disagrees with us, it challenges one of our beliefs, we may just reject that out of hand because it doesn't agree with us. So confirmation bias is this idea that if it agrees with us, we like it and we just accept it, right? And there's a lot of ways that this appears. People have been jumping on and sharing this like false trend on, and this was a TikTok trend for a while. It's actually still going on. This idea that somehow we're all magnetized as a result of the COVID vaccines. First, it was the claim that the magnets were sticking to the arms because of the microchip. And then that belief morphed, and the anti-vaxxers started to suggest that it's not a microchip. It's actually a concentration of heavy metals in the vaccine itself that's causing us to be magnetized all over our whole body. But like, people are seeing this and they're just accepting it at face value. They're not challenging it. And some of these have gone quite viral and gotten a lot of likes and a lot of engagement. Motivated reasoning is kind of the next step. And this is where we have a belief and we are going to go out and we're going to actively look for anything and everything that will support what we believe, right? It's kind of the opposite of the scientific method. I believe A, so I'm going to go out and look for anything that will support that belief, and I will reject anything that disagrees with this. We see this really commonly in the last several months, and it's still going on. There's a number of people in the QAnon movement who believe that Donald Trump will at some point soon be re-inaugurated. He will become president. Joe Biden will no longer be president, right? So there's a lot of these things where people are trying to suggest that Biden's not the legitimate president, someone's a body double. an interesting thing that came up recently, and this is something that somebody was looking for this. The official account, the official Instagram account of the president, posted an image of Joe Biden on the phone in the Oval Office, and somebody looked at it and said that that it had been photoshopped. That if you look at the reflection in the window behind the president, it's actually not Joe Biden. They see the back of Donald Trump's head, and they connected to a cue drop from March of 2019 saying reflections are important, right? And then what they did was they zoomed in on this on the window, and they said, see, that's not Joe Biden's head, that's Donald Trump's head. Ignoring, of course, the fact that that's armored glass, multi-layered glass, and there's multiple reflections there, and one of them actually does look very much like Joe Biden, the back of Joe Biden's head. But motivated reasoning is this idea. It's a very active process, right? People are going out looking for things. They're trying to make anything fit their belief, whereas confirmation bias is a very passive acceptance. Okay, another bias, very, very common, is called proportionality bias. This is generally that major events must have major causes. This is fundamental, for example, to the Kennedy assassination conspiracy theories, right? There's no way that the president of the United States was assassinated by a lone gunman. There had to be some bigger cause. We see this with the COVID-19, right? People are trying to suggest that somehow all of these major public health crises had to do with electromagnetic fields. We also see this in the murder of George Floyd. There's this belief that George Floyd was not murdered by convicted police officer Derek Chauvin, but no, but that actually wasn't a police officer. It wasn't Derek Chauvin. This is part of a psychological operation perpetuated by the New World Order, because they're going to federalize all of our local police and take over. So there's this idea that it's a much bigger conspiracy. It wasn't just a cop who held his knee on George Floyd's neck and killed him. Somewhat similar to proportionality bias is intentionality bias. This is the idea that accidents don't just happen. Everything has to have some sort of intentional cause, right? So this is from actually a verified Twitter account of a woman who ran for Congress in California. She's a prominent QAnon influencer, and she believes that part of the COVID restrictions and the mask mandates, that this has all been a hoax, and it's been going on for some time because Hollywood created the television show The Masked Singer to condition us into accepting masks and mask mandates without question, right? So the whole idea that there was all of this, there must be some intentional act behind it, right? We see this with the wildfires, especially in California and Australia. There are a lot of people who believe that those fires were not the result of unattended campfires or lightning strikes or bone dry conditions because of climate change and whatnot. Nope, these were started by direct energy weapons fired from aircraft or from space-based satellites. So someone deliberately started these fires for one reason or another. And then we also see there's a lot of this intentionality bias behind the pandemic and the COVID virus and the vaccines and whatnot. One of the ways that motivated reasoning looks like is called illusory pattern perception, or patternicity. This is where people take random details, random facts, random pieces of information, and put them together into some sort of cause and effect or causal pattern, and use that pattern to justify some sort of a belief, right? So this example, people took all these random things together, right? That somehow Joe Biden is going to start World War III, right? So the red E in Biden, and you turn it looks like a trident. You turn it on the side, it looks like a trident. There's a red wave. It's World War III. There's a lot of weird stuff happening. For people who are conspiracy minded, this makes a lot of sense. But this is what patternicity looks like. People just put things together and they try to say that it's evidence. This is what's common in the wildfires. People claiming that if you look at a map of the wildfires and you look at a map of these proposed train lines, clearly the government is starting these wildfires to make way for these rail lines, right? Yes, there are some similarities, but that doesn't mean that there's a cause and effect relationship. And in fact, if you know anything about the geography of California, if you look at the map on the left, it's the entire state of California from the Mexico border up to the border with Oregon. But if you look at the rail map line, it's just from the Bay Area south. They're not even the same maps. And one way that this often looks like is called gematria. This is the idea behind you give letters or words some sort of numerical value. You take the numerical value, you look for a pattern, you do some weird math, and you create this pattern to create some sort of evidence. And in this case, they were using, the number 17 is really popular in QAnon because Q is the 17th letter of the alphabet. So people were trying to use this as evidence that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is Q. She's not Q, obviously. Ron Watkins is probably Q for all of them. So the last thing is that it's really important that it's really natural for us to look for patterns. Our brains are always looking for patterns. We're always trying to make connections, right? We see random things, we see coincidences. It's a totally normal thing. When we start to create those patterns, when we're starting to interpret them in deliberate ways, because we're trying to create evidence, that's where critical thinking goes off the rails. And we're starting to engage in faulty logic and faulty reasoning. And we're down a path of misinformation. So what can you do? A couple of things that I just want to mention really quickly. Modeling is and always will be one of the most important education tools around. You can be part of the solution to help us push back and fight for facts by just verifying what you're looking at, verifying your information, verifying your sources, know what you're sharing before you share it, and actually help to debunk that misinformation. So that brings me to the end here. So I'm just going to pause here. I'm going to drop a link to a quick survey if you have just a few minutes to do a quick survey for me. I'll drop this in the chat. I'll also drop some links to some of our resources. So I'll stop here. I know we're a little over time. I threw a lot at you. I would love to know what questions you have or comments.
First of all, thank you so much, John. This has been eye-opening, and I think it really clarified the need for the policy circles briefs, to be honest with you, because we've got a wealth of information out there about very important topics, and you can trust the information that we're giving you. So always go back and check our library of policy briefs. If that's one way to fact check, ladies, is the news that you're hearing out there. Does anybody have any questions for John at this point? You can pop them in the chat. Otherwise, I will just do a little bit of housekeeping while you guys are maybe thinking about questions that you have.
There's one thing in the chat from Kate Herzog. She says debunking, however, can amplify the disinformation. Yes, it can, depending on how you do it. But the thing is that a lot of research does show that the sooner a piece of misinformation is called into question, the less viral it goes. So if somebody posts something that's false and you sort of push back, you call it into question, and you share new information for people to look at that sort of shows that it may not be true or isn't, that will actually slow down how viral that particular piece of misinformation goes. But it also can help make the person who shared the misinformation a little bit more aware of what they're sharing, and hope maybe making them a little bit more cautious. So yeah, it can, but you have to do it in a careful way, and really make sure that you're demonstrating that something has been shown to be false. And we do have some resources on that at newslit.org. There's a whole lot more that we can go into with this. It is a very complex topic. I threw a lot of information at you, but hopefully you found this to be informative and useful.
It is, and it's just the beginning, because we're never going to stop on social media. That's not ending anytime soon. And so we're always going to need to have this skill to build upon. So ladies, thank you. John, thank you so much for your time today, for the work of the News Literacy Project to help us be more informed. And ladies, don't be scared to tell people if you think that what they're spreading is false information. And we can always do that in a kind way. So wanted to let you guys know we have 2 really great events coming up in July. They are, again, webinars. So July 13th, our Texas State Leadership Council is going to be putting on a webinar about boards and commissions. So ladies, if you want to serve your, state, your local community, but you don't want to run for office, you need to learn about boards and commissions because there's lots of open spaces out there, and it's a great way to serve and to give back to your community and let your skills be highlighted in maybe your realm of expertise. So tune in July 13th at noon for our webinar on boards and commissions. And then we have our Move the Needle event on July 28th, and it's all about transparency and accountability with our elected officials, our government, how they're spending our money. So definitely check your inbox. You will be getting invitations to both of those events. We would love for you to sign up for those webinars. And we have another in the chat here. We've got, is there a link to view your presentation? Yes, we will have, this is recorded. So you will be able to go back and watch this again. And then John, do you have what are your resources like on the News Literacy Project website?
Yeah, so the first question is I'll email a PDF of the slides so that you can share with people so if they want to take a look at those. But if you go to our website at newslit.org, there are two really important tabs. One is for educators, where you can see all of our resources available, links to our Technology Virtual Classroom, Newslit Nation, our educator network, and a number of others. But we also have a tab that's called For Everyone. So this is for the general public. And there you can see the resources that we have with resources and tips and tutorials and things. There's even a Checkology for adults where you can do some of the lessons and you can see the things that we have there. So we have a great deal of resources, and all of our resources, including the ones that are for the classroom, are completely free. Thanks to the generosity of the foundations and organizations that fund us. We do not charge for any of our resources.
Wonderful. We did get one really good question here. John, I want you to address this. The main news stations seem to be so biased one way or the other. What can we trust? Our policy.
Yeah, that's a really complicated question, which a lot of people don't realize is that first, a lot of the discussions of bias of the news media are often based on perception, right? We perceive, and they are based on in realities, right? If we look at Fox News, when we look at their commentary, right, the bias is based off of mainly the commentary and opinion content. Yes, Fox News, predominantly conservative commentary. MSNBC, predominantly liberal commentary. But it's not 100%. There are liberal voices that appear on Fox News. There are conservative voices that appear on MSNBC, right? So we can't say that everything that they put out follows that same bias. And that ignores the straight news content that is put out, which is actually largely, free of bias, or at least trying to minimize bias in ways that are important. So one of the lessons that we actually teach we have a lesson called Understanding Bias, is that there are ways that bias does creep into straight news reporting, but we have to try to look at it and identify it in a more objective way, right? So for example, demographic bias, this is one that's very, very common, right? So a news story comes out about a young person who's been charged with a crime, right? What image do they use to illustrate that story, right? Is it the picture of them in their sports, high school sports uniform, or their graduation photo, or is it their mugshot, right? We also we see this with like police officers who have been accused of misconduct or even charged with crimes, right? Do we show them in their police uniform, or do we show them in their mugshot? So there are some, and this is what's very common is like if it's a young white person, predominantly you'll see that graduation photo or a sports photo or something along those lines. Whereas if it's a young person of color, it's more likely a mugshot, right? And that's a legitimate way that bias creeps into reporting. But so being able to objectively identify it, that's how we can push back against news organizations and say, hey, that's problematic. You really need to address that, right? So yeah, there is a lot of bias in the commentary and the things that they do. And so it's important to recognize that conversations of bias in that context are kind of irrelevant because it's supposed to be biased. But if we're going to talk about bias in news coverage, we have to find a more objective way of measuring it rather than our perception. That was a really long answer. But it's an important conversation, and it's one that there's a lot of confusion and there's a lot of sort of misimpressions based on it.
Yeah, thank you for that, John. And again, it underscores the importance of having basic knowledge, and that's where our policy briefs can help with the basic knowledge of policy topics, because then you go to the news and you can decipher it a little bit better. And I always like to say, I never like when a news reporter uses adjectives in their reporting, because I think I'll put the adjectives in. That's
Yeah.
you just tell me the facts. So anyway, thank you so much for your time today, John. We really appreciate it. And I know our women are going to be going to that News Literacy Project website to learn more. And again, ladies, watch your inbox for the invitations to our upcoming webinars, and have a fabulous rest of your day. Bye. And thanks again, John. Have a great day.